Good afternoon, book lovers. This is Robert Boyd coming at you with yet another book report. And this week, I'm looking at a journal. It's not quite a scholarly journal, although I guess when you hear me describe it, you might disagree. Anyway, I picked it up at Brazos bookstore. It's called Music and Literature, and it's I'm not sure how many times a year it comes out, but this is number 4. It's a square-bound book, and what I've noticed it on the shelves at Brazos bookstore before, and been curious about it, and I finally pulled the trigger and picked up a copy. And what they do is they look at several musicians and literary artists, and they focus on, in this case, on 4 of them. Novelist Claudici Specter, Baroque period instrument violinist Maya Hamburger, composer and improviser on the double bass Barry Guy, and American poet Mary, I'm going to guess on her pronunciation of her last name, Mary Ruffle. It's a very mournful last name, if you ask me. And because because it concentrates on 4 of them, but it's a whole book basically. It has a variety of articles on each of the subjects. Some of the articles are critical. Some of them are more personal, and some of them are interviews, in the case of Maya Hamburger and Barry Guy and Mary Ruffle. No interviews with Claudici because she is dead. Anyway, in format, it reminds me a little bit of this old art magazine, Parquet, defunct now, unfortunately, where they would have like, oops, just knocked a book off my table. They would have 2 or 3 main subjects and multiple essays on each one. So the main person I'm going to talk about in this book is Claudici Specter. She was a Brazilian novelist, born in 1920 and died at a very young age. Actually, same age as I am right now. 57 in 1977. She was born in Ukraine, and her family was fleeing pogroms because the Russian Revolution was occurring, and they were it was brutal, and they made their way first to Romania and then to Brazil, and this all happened before she was 1 year old. So she doesn't have any conscious memory of Ukraine, although presumably her mother and father told her about it. Her mother died when she was young of syphilis, which was apparently a chronic condition for her because she had been, at least it's said she had been gang raped during one of the pogroms. So that's horrible, tragic. She had a Jewish first name, but when they moved to Brazil, all the kids, except for one of them, had their names changed to more Portuguese-sounding names. And she grew up to be a beloved writer of modernist fiction. Her first story was published in 1940. Then her most famous novel, The Passion According to G.H., was published in 1964, year after I was born. And then she died of ovarian cancer at age 57. Now, she seems likely to have remained a fairly obscure author as far as American readers go. but for a couple of things. One was that a famous French thinker, Hélène Cixous, and I'm probably mangling her name. She was a one of the post-structuralist theorists in France, and was a feminist theorist. Wrote actually gave a series of papers about her in, like, I think 1980, and they've been collected into a book, which you can order if you're seriously interested. But and the name of the book is called Reading with Claudici Specter. And by the way, her name, I'm pronouncing it Claudici because that's kind of, I mean, with my thick American accent, I'm definitely getting it wrong, but that's kind of how you would say it in Portuguese. And I want to say Clarice because everyone in Brazil just refers to her by her first name, which I think is, I mean, I don't know, it'd be like if everyone knew Herman Melville as just Harmon, I guess. Um, and it's not like an uncommon name or anything. So it's weird that they would just refer to it as Clarice, but it's an endearing quirk of Brazilian literati. And so, like I said, her section is a series of essays, and the reason so Hélène Cixous helped popularize, or make her known amongst the intelligentsia with her essays that people read, and I'm going to return to that. But what really brought her to the attention of American readers was a biography of her written by Benjamin Moser. And Moser's an interesting person for a bunch of reasons. He was born here in Houston, and his mother, for a while, managed Brazos Bookstore, which is a longtime favorite bookstore here in Houston, and still is a favorite, still open. In fact, that's where I got Music and Literature #4. And he recently won a Pulitzer Prize for his biography of Susan Sontag. So he's kind of a big deal. And this biography of, it's the one I knocked on the floor, hold on. This biography of Clarice is called Why This World? And it's good. And because it is good, and because he dug up a bunch of information about her early life, or really her family's early life in Ukraine, and I think because she was basically unknown in the U.S. except amongst hardcore literati, it took off. And under his direction, most of her novels have been retranslated into English. Earlier translations were considered inadequate in some ways. And so anyway, there's essays about her. Some of them are by Brazilian writers, and they're in Portuguese. And those, more than any of the other essays, seem personal, like they're almost like letters to Clarice. These are people that read these books at a young age and have a powerful personal connection with them, and a connection that's formed in part because they speak the same language, which that's always a problem when you're dealing with translated books. How are you sure that you actually know them from the translations? And if the earlier translations were not good, then that's an issue, right? So one of the writers is, there's several other writers besides the Brazilian writers. A lot of the people who have translated stories or novels of hers write, and so Benjamin Moser gets mentioned in context of being the person sort of in charge of all the translations. But the most famous writer, who, at least most famous in the sense that I knew who she was, who writes about her is Rachel Kushner, and viewers might remember her as the author of The Flamethrowers, a really good novel that came out a few years ago, set in the worlds of high-speed motorcycle racing, fine art, and Italian radical politics. A bizarre combination of settings and a totally entertaining novel. Anyway, she said she had discovered the Spectre by reading Eline Cixous, and you get the impression that Rachel Kushner is a very serious reader. I mean, the kind of reader who reads, French post-structuralist theory for the heck of it. And she thought that Cixous' explanation of the Spectre was adequate, appropriate. I'm sorry. I'm gonna look at what she wrote and quote it. Oh, well, I'm gonna do that first. Hold on. So, one thing she writes, which is totally true, personally true, is that an exhaustive and fascinating biographical account of the Spectre's mysterious existence, Why This World, by Benjamin Moser, was widely reviewed when it came out in 2009, and for the moment, many more people in the U.S. had read Claudici Specter about Claudici Specter than had actually read her work. And now Moser's overseeing new translations of 5 of Specter's 9 novels. But then, so later on, she's talking about Cixous, and let's see. I'm sorry, I'm thinking here, making sure I get to. Oh, she talks about Cixous and how Cixous read the Spectre. I mean, I'm not finding the passage that I thought I was going to find. And wait a second, maybe it's here. This is amateur hour. Okay. She's Cixous talking about a passage in the Spectre wrote about drinking Ovaltine. And there was also the startling suspicion that Ovaltine is good. It is I who am no good. It is I who am no good, Eline Cixous wrote famously of the Ovaltine moment. And it was going through her writings that I originally found Claudici Specter. Cixous wrote copiously on her work, and even took the Spectre's reputation as, quote, the Sphinx, unquote, as a cosmetics tip, and made her habit of appearing publicly in full Egyptian eyeliner. I'll post a photo of Cixous, but I don't think it really has the full Egyptian eyeliner. Many of Cixous' writings on Le Spectre were actually pedagogical lectures given in the early 1980s at the University of Paris 8, lectures whose effect in transcription is as magisterial as the eyeliner. I would have been better off reading Le Spectre directly, rather than in conjunction with the claims about her made by Cixous, whose own tone didn't wear off for me until I had occasion to pore over these new editions of Le Spectre's work. So she didn't just read. She doesn't read Portuguese, apparently. So she had read Le Spectre's work in the earlier translations, and that made her agree with Cixous' interpretation. But rereading them in these new translations made her disagree, which is a weird philological approach to reading an author, but I've done it myself. I've read multiple translations of Faust by Goethe just to see how people did it. and it's quite different depending on who you read. So all you art lovers out there will like this little bit that I flagged. Okay. I don't believe Specter was consciously experimental, although really that's a hard statement to swallow. There's no Oedipal break being put into play as with a new novelist, no Ulipuan limitation created in order to unlock something. If anything, there might be a link between her and the great Brazilian visual artist of her generation, Ligia Clark, Ligia Pape, and Elio Oiticica. I thought that was interesting. I don't really see that connection, but if you think I'm wrong and you're in Houston, you can see artwork by all three of those artists at the Museum of Fine Arts. It's now in their it's always been in their permanent collection, but it's now on display in their new building. So anyway, Rachel Kushner's essay on Ligia Clark, on Claudici was quite interesting. And Benjamin Moser's biography is quite interesting. I have a copy of The Passion According to G.H., and I've started it, but I just haven't finished it. And I'll describe the premise because it doesn't really have a plot per se. A woman, a bourgeois woman sculptor, is in her apartment in Rio, presumably, and enters her maid's room and sees a roach on the floor and crushes it. I can't remember whether she steps on it or whether she crushes it with a book or something. And then has like an epiphany of some sort and eats the roach. The entire book is that episode. That rather disgusting episode. So it's hard for me to take Rachel Kushner's idea that she's not consciously experimental. Anyway, as I read that, and I read about, the retranslations of all our books, because apparently the earlier ones were not good, it made me think of a writer that I like quite a bit, who's a contemporary of Claudici, named João Guimarães Rosa. He's widely considered to be the greatest Brazilian writer of the 20th century, although I think it's one of those things where he's a dude, so up until any criticism that I might have read, he got an automatic leg up on his competition in that estimation. But I think he's an important writer, and I read one of his books, one of his stories in a anthology of Brazilian literature. Third Bank of the River was the name of the story, and a very mysterious name. And apparently he had some books translated by Knopf in the early 60s, and they're nearly impossible to find. I mean, libraries had them for a while, but rare book dealers, the scam of rare book dealers is to go to a library, check out the book that they want, and just never return it and just pay the fine, which is nominal. So I'm gonna reach over here quickly. I have this book, Devil to Pay in the Backlands, which is in Portuguese is Grandes Setaus Veredas, which does not translate the devil to pay. And it apparently, the word is that the translation doesn't really capture the bravura modernism of João Guimarães Rosa. but it's pretty good. I mean, I remember I actually read that book first, checking it out from a library in Portland, Oregon, and I should have done the scuzzy book dealer thing and just not returned it. But instead, I waited many decades later to buy this from a rare book dealer and paid a pretty penny for it. And it's been out of print since it was published. It just never, he's no Giorgio Amato. He never caught on in the U.S. Um, and he never had a Benjamin Moser to champion him. So I would love to see that his works retranslated into English. Anyway, back to music and literature. The second part is about a violinist named Maya Hamburger, and who's from Switzerland, and her partner Barry Guy, who's a Irish double bass player. She plays Baroque violin and in early music ensembles, playing Baroque music like Bach and Telemann and so on a violin that has catgut strings and very sensitive to humidity and will go out of tune pretty quickly. I mean, there are reasons that modern violins are better than Baroque instruments, but the whole idea of the early music movement is to try to recreate the sound that Bach and Telemann and Vivaldi and so on heard when their orchestras played. They can't get into the minds of the composers, but they can at least play the same instruments the composer had. And that's how she met Barry Guy, who's a double bassist. So he would play in early music ensembles the continuo part, and I'm not really sure what a continuo is. But his thing is he's a composer and he's improviser. So early on he was in jazz bands, but he subsequently got into improvising in sort of I don't know, I'm not sure what you want to call it. There's definitely kind of a school of improvisatory music that's more modernist in approach, and I think that's sort of where he comes from now, as opposed to say a Ornette Coleman style free jazz sort of thing. So I while I was reading the pieces on the pair, and they work together, so that's why they're sort of joined together here. I listened to a bunch of their music, and one of the pieces that Guy talks about in one of the articles in an interview with him is called "After the Rain," and he was inspired by the Max Ernst painting "Europe After the Rain," which I'm showing you right now, and it has like these these modernist or contemporary style musical freakouts, punctuated alternately with long, thick, tonal chords, and I like it. I like the sound of it a lot. I would have put that in the beginning, but the 30 seconds you heard were Barry Guy improvising. It's the only one I could find online that I could download. From 1989, music that he recorded with soprano Vanessa Magnus, but you're not hearing any of Vanessa Magnus, just Barry Guy. Now, I do want to say that in the 3 sections, there's also a visual art section. And so to go back to Claudici, she was a painter, but in my opinion, not a very good painter, at least based on the reproductions I see in music and literature. So I'll show you some. But Barry Guy, before he became a musician, was an architect. So he has a kind of visual thing. And like a lot of like contemporary avant-garde musicians, composers, he doesn't do, the staff, the treble and bass staff, and it's not, I mean, sometimes he does if he needs to communicate that to his fellow players, but he'll make it an entire artwork that somehow his fellow instrumentalists are meant to interpret. And so, because there's this interpretive aspect to reading the music, he's allowed to like go crazy on how he portrays it, and those were really interesting. Um, and they reflect his architecture background. He was one of his pieces is based on poems by an Irish poet named Carrie Hardy, which I thought were really good. They included a selection of her poems, and I'm going to do a Robin O'Neill here and read one of them. This is a poem by Carrie Hardy for Maya Hamburger, or dedicated to Maya Hamburger, and it's called Musician. There's something in the presence, in the carriage, a dignity that makes the player disappear, as though a lamp's been trimmed and lit and lifted, a clear glass funnel placed near the flame. The sound runs through the body, lifting clear, so that I fly upon those sweet high notes. Sounds that belong, not here, but somewhere else, some other level that we partly dwell on. As though the listening is giving from there, and we are being bowed like violins. And when it's done, exhausted, we fall back into the dailiness that lets us have our home. It seems like a really beautiful way to describe being transported by the music and then coming back to earth. Anyway, the last section is the least interesting to me, because it was about a poet named Mary Ruffle, an American poet, and she the poems that they reproduced I thought were pretty good. I mean, let me say something about poetry here, and just in general, is that for me, reading poetry is actually quite difficult. I was having a Zoom conversation with a couple of friends of mine a few days ago. My friend Eric was saying he almost never reads anything but poetry. And why I find reading poetry difficult is because I'm so accustomed to prose and the way you can skip over a word here or there, or, you know, if you're reading a paragraph, you can pretty much read the first sentence and get it. And you don't have to read every little tiny bit of prose. And it's possible that in doing so, I'm shortchanging the writers. I probably am. Especially a writer who really labors over every word, like Vladimir Nabokov or somebody. It seems like kind of a shame not to read every single word he wrote in a novel. But in most prose, I just sort of get to the point. But reading poetry requires a different kind of attention for me. I have to read every word and be careful not to try and read it like prose. But when it works, and I thought Mary Ruffle's poems were good. The essays about her are not that interesting, and as I read them, I kept waiting for them to quote some of the poetry, because the quotes of the poetry were the most interesting parts. Anyway, she's a well-known American poet. She was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize this year, but she didn't get it. But I think people who get nominated eventually get it if they don't die first. Anyway, that's music. Oh, wait, one last thing about Mary Ruffle. She also has a visual art thing, but I thought her visual art was kind of trite. She basically takes an existing book and blanks out the words so that only a few words are left, and the few words that are left might be interesting, but I wasn't that interested in looking at them. Anyway, music and literature. I think I'll read some additional volumes, although it's tough reading because it's all criticism and there's a certain amount of theory involved, although fortunately not too much. But one thing about it that I liked was how it went deep into each of its subjects, and that's what appeals to me about this kind of journal. So I might read it again, but not right away. I am going to read The Passion According to GH, so expect one of these about that in the future. But I'll probably read something a little easier than this. This is a kind of publication that you feel smarter for having read it. At least I do. And anyway, that's Music and Literature. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.